Hey guys, I am the Comics Kid 2099, and I am here to do a little bit of an offbeat video. If you've watched any of my videos in the past, you probably know that I am a pretty big fan of Batman, and I am going to do something that's sort of Batman-ish in this video. If you can see what's on the top two shelves of that bookshelf behind me, that is all mostly Batman-related stuff. However, I am not specifically going to be talking about Batman in this video. Instead, I am going to be talking about the top 5 movies that are, in my humble opinion, the best Batman movies that don't have Batman in them. You might be thinking, what? What is this guy talking about? These movies are all, in one way or another, tonally very similar to Batman, and, in my opinion, work very well as Batman movies. A couple of these movies are even better than some of the actual Batman movies that have had Batman in them. So, without any further delay, let's get started. Okay, one further delay really quickly. I just want to say, I am not any good at numbering things in any particular order. I can't do this and say, this is the number 1 best movie without Batman and this is the number 5 movie. I can't do that, so I'm just going to go in the order that they're stacked up here. So I'm not saying that one movie is necessarily better than the other. I'm just saying this is the order in which I am going to talk about them. The first movie that I will be talking about is Seven. This movie was directed by David Fincher, and actually it is pretty much the only movie by this guy that I have enjoyed. He did Alien 3 and he did The Game, and I didn't really like either of those. I'm sure he's done some other movies that I have not seen, but out of the movies that I have seen from him, this is the best one in my opinion. The reason that this would be a fantastic movie that is set in the Batman world is because it's basically a movie about the GCPD. I mean, you've got your kind of psychopathic Batman-esque villain in the form of Kevin Spacey, and then you've got 2 cops who are just trying to do their jobs in a city that is very dirty, very corrupt, and they kind of have to break the rules a little bit in order to do their jobs. If Batman existed in this world, then it would be against the rules to call in his help, and yet quite often the GCPD does just that. I like this movie quite a bit, although I don't watch it a whole lot because it is kind of a depressing movie if you've seen it. And Kevin Spacey just feels like he belongs in the world of Batman. I mean, the whole 7 sins and each kill is a representation of one of those sins. That is very much something that I would expect from one of his more twisted, really grotesque villains. So, that is number 1, the movie Seven. In fact, when I watch this movie, I like to pretend that it is actually set in Gotham City and that this is just a week that Batman is not in town. That is how very much it feels like a Batman movie to me. The next movie that feels like a Batman movie is Blade Runner. This movie is set in the future, but it's a very dark, kind of 1930s feel of future. You've seen those black and white movies like The Roaring Twenties or Casablanca. This movie feels like it's very closely related to those movies, but it is set in the future with flying cars and robots and stuff. Honestly, I know a lot of people really prefer Batman to be realistic and grounded, but in the comics, Batman does not live in a realistic and grounded world. He lives in a world with Amazon immortal princesses and Martians who can do anything, and you've got the Flash, you've got an army of Green Lanterns who can also do anything. That is the world that Batman lives in. If you were to see a Batman movie that kind of foregoes all of the realism and grounded in reality stuff, I think this would be very close to what you would get. A world that would occasionally have Batman fighting robots, or, you know, a city that doesn't necessarily look like it's just Chicago with a different name, kind of like the Nolan movies, unfortunately. Really, this one, along with a couple of the others that I'm going to talk about, it's the atmosphere of the movie that feels very Batman-y. I'm not saying that you could necessarily see a Batman comic where Batman is hunting down robots and kills them for a living, because Batman is very much a hero who doesn't believe in killing the enemy. And so, I kind of don't think that you could just say, oh, if you just replace Harrison Ford with Batman, put some bat ears on him, that's a Batman movie. No, not really. This one is really more the atmosphere, and I've kind of already talked about that. The city feels like what Gotham City really would feel like if you kind of jumped ahead 10 or 15 years. And if you've got people like Mr. Terrific or Lex Luthor or all of the mad, crazy scientists in the world of DC Comics, the modern day would look a little futuristic, definitely more so than what we've seen in any live-action film so far. I think it's also worth noting that this movie feels very much like it influenced the world of Batman Beyond. It's a very used, dirty future, but it also kind of has that timeless quality that you would find in the old movies from the 1930s, which I was talking about earlier. The same could basically be said for this and for Batman Beyond. They both feel very similar in that regard. The next movie I want to talk about is one of my favorite movies, and it is Escape from New York. I watch this movie every Christmas Eve. I really couldn't tell you why. It's just something I did one Christmas Eve a few years ago, and ever since then I'm like, I want to do that again each year. So I have been. The reason I'm choosing this is because it really, if you've ever heard of Batman No Man's Land, kind of feels a lot like Escape from New York. You've got this isolated, crime-ridden city that is basically run by all of the scumbags, and then you've got this guy who's not especially a good guy, but he's in there trying to get out the President of the United States. I'm not going to get into the movie, it's kind of sort of complicated, but if you've read Batman No Man's Land, you probably know that that sounds very similar, because it sounds very much like Escape from New York. Batman No Man's Land involves Batman and his immediate allies kind of trying to fix Gotham City after a giant earthquake hit the city, and basically the United States is like, we wash our hands of Gotham, we're not going to fix this, let's just let everything die, and then we'll go in like 20 years and we'll just bulldoze the whole thing. That was basically Batman No Man's Land, and in a lot of ways they feel very similar. I would not be surprised at all if the cadre of writers who were working on No Man's Land had been highly influenced by Escape from New York. For that reason, this one is more the plot similarities that made me think that's very similar to Batman No Man's Land. So if we were ever going to have a Batman No Man's Land movie, I just don't think it would work because we basically already had it with Escape from New York. And honestly, Escape from New York kind of just condenses everything. You get all that you need. Batman No Man's Land, a whole lot of it is, you know, the Joker has this territory, Two-Face has that territory, etc. It would really need to be like a trilogy of Batman No Man's Land to really work. And I think this movie, even though it predates No Man's Land by about a decade, it basically just eschews all of the minutia and all of the small details and just gets right to the core of the idea. And I think that's a big reason why it works for me. The fourth one I want to talk about is Dark City. This is not a very well-known movie. I heard about it from a YouTube channel that is highly into movies, the MacGuffin Podcast. They talked about it, and it sounded very interesting to me. So when I saw it discounted at a DVD store, it might have been going out of business, I went ahead and bought it, watched it. I really loved it. Now, if you've seen it, there is something about this that is very way out there. It's very science fiction-y, even more so than the world of DC Comics, really. DC Comics, as I said earlier in the video, you know, that's a world with a gorilla city and a Green Lantern Corps and an island full of immortal Amazonian warrior women. Even with all of that, when you consider all of that, it's still fairly grounded compared to this movie. However, once again, like Blade Runner, it's the atmosphere of this movie that really makes me think that's kind of Batman-y. It's perpetually nighttime in Dark City, hence the name. You've got this cop who is trying to solve this murder. He's basically a good man, but he's in a world that's not really trying to cooperate with him. And I mean world in a literal sense. Maybe I've spoiled too much already, But this movie, like I say, it's not so much the plot. If you go and look up the plot, because I'm not going to spoil this movie, you're going to say, that's not really what a Batman story would be about. And no, it's not. It's the atmosphere and the tone. If you watch this movie, it feels very timeless, and that was definitely a deliberate action by everyone involved in this movie. They don't want it to feel like, okay, this was made in the late 1990s. They want it to feel like it could happen in the 80s or the 70s. It could really happen at any time. If you've ever seen Batman the Animated Series, that's something that show was all about, trying to be very timeless. It felt at times like it was set in the distant past, but then you also had stuff that made it feel very modern. And so whenever you have all of these anachronisms from different time periods, it kind of makes it feel more timeless than it ever will if you just try and keep it in the present day. And this movie, Dark City, it does that very well in my opinion. Shortly before filming this video, I was not sure what my number 5 would be, and in fact, I was very close to only doing 4 movies that would be very similar to Batman movies, and then I thought of this one. This is a movie that I actually do not own. This belongs to my dad. It is Support Your Local Sheriff. Now, this is a comedy movie starring James Garner. And basically the idea is James Garner comes to this town, and it's pretty much a lawless town, and then he becomes the sheriff, and he starts doing things not exactly the way you would expect. He does things kind of unorthodox, if you will. But he is doing a good job. He's bringing law to this town. Now let me reiterate, this is a comedy movie. This is not a serious movie at all. But the idea of you've got this guy, he just kind of walks into town, and he is not going to exactly play by the book, but he is going to bring the law to this town. He is going to oust all of the corruption. Sounds like Batman, doesn't it? In fact, I was very much reminded of Batman Begins when I watched this. I know with Batman, he was born in Gotham, and then he left and came back, whereas this guy, it's his first time in the city. But it's very much... If Batman Begins didn't have Batman and it was a comedy movie, you'd be very close to what this movie is. Like I say, this is probably the one that is the least like Batman because it's not at all dark or brooding, which is a sense that you usually associate with Batman stories. But I think the sense of justice, the sense of I'm going to do what's right, even if it's not necessarily legal, that's very much what Batman is about. He is, by his very nature, a lawbreaker in that he is taking the law into his own hands. But at the same time, he is fighting for justice, not necessarily the law. Now, this guy is, of course, a lawman, so he is fighting for the law. And it's not like he's, taking in people who don't need to be arrested or whatever, but he knows they're bad guys. He's following the law. He's just doing it in a way that hasn't ever been done in a city. You've got people in this town, it's like, well, that whole family, they're all lawbreakers, but we can't go in and take in one of them who breaks the law because then the rest of them will come and kill us all. And he's like, we'll see about that. Oh, what'd you think of my James Garner impression? No bueno. That is all I have to say about the 5 movies that are Batman movies without Batman in them. I'm curious what you guys have to say. I'm sure anyone who watches this will probably disagree with the Support Your Local Sheriff movie. That's okay. I really needed one to round it off to 5, but I do think that it is very Batman-y in a lot of very central ways. I'm curious, what did you guys think? If you could come up with a top 5 list, I'd love to see what you have to think in the comments below or in a video response. Just remember, the basic rule is come up with 5 movies that would work very well as a Batman movie, but do not have Batman in them. And so, I will see you guys later with another kind of video. Until then, I am going to go answer the bat signal and talk to Commissioner Gordon. I'll see you next time.